Hi, folks. So let's get started. Thanks for your patience. My name is Maliha Safri, and you all are here at Workplace Democracy and Democratic Ownership, moving from theory to strategy. And to my right is our Richard Wolff and Gar Alperovitz. I'll introduce them in just a second. This panel is about one of the most pressing issues. What does economic democracy look like? What does it look like at the very on-the-ground level when you work in a place that you could or would consider democratic? How is it different? How does it feel different? How does it make you act differently? These are important questions. Some might consider them related to the issue of subjectivity. But in addition to that, we have other important differences. How would such a workplace be related to the material aspects of your life? Would you be better off? Would you have more job stability? Last summer, I visited a pretty large workplace, a worker collective that could be considered as characterized by workplace democracy. And they produce washing machines. And we're in the middle of a serious economic crisis. The demand for washing machines has fallen, along with all white appliances, especially since housing sales have slumped, right? So one of the interesting things is while they're selling less washing machines for the last 2 years, all of the workers, around 2,500 workers, got together and decided to take a 7.5% pay cut so that all of the jobs would be preserved for everyone in that workplace. And now that's fascinating, and we could spend a lot of time talking about that, and it's very easy to dive into. But I think we also have to zoom out from that micro level, right? And that's what our two speakers are here to help us do today. How do you zoom out and think about maintaining, building conditions that would support such workplaces and communities? What kinds of supporting institutions do we need? What kind of middle and, let's say, upper level, or using the lens of political economy, what kind of meso, macro institutions, governments would we need to have these kinds of workplaces? So first, I'll introduce Gar. Gar Alperovitz is the author of What Then Must We Do? Straight Talk About the Next American Revolution, 2013, and 2011 book, America Beyond Capitalism. I believe this one's outside, if you want to take a look at it. Gar's work, the trouble with these two kind of guys is we could be here all day talking about what it is that they've done during their lifetimes. So I'll just stick to the last 5-10 years. So Gar's work has been really important on the evergreen projects in Cleveland. Incredible, pioneering project in the United States that has become the example par excellence of worker collective, cooperative complexes that seek to emulate some of the institutional networks of Mondragon in Spain. Worker cooperatives and all of the, let's say, UW center developers. In University of Wisconsin, there's a big center for cooperatives. Such kinds of experiences don't fare very well in isolation. They work better with partner organizations, worker centers, universities, and Gar has been very important in pioneering this experience called the Democracy Collaborative, also a sponsor of this panel. And that collaborative partnered with a lot of institutions in Cleveland to produce this series of experiences. And it's paying off. There are sister projects in Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., Amarillo, Texas, the most recent one in Springfield, Massachusetts, where they've raised about $250,000 for the exact same kind of model. And of course, he has a long history of activism going back to the U.S. steelworkers in Youngstown, an experience that he writes of in this most recent book. Richard Wolff is Professor Emeritus at UMass Amherst in the Economics Department. He is now at the School of International Affairs at the New School. His latest book is Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. This is upstairs in the book room. It's one of 3 books he published last year. 3. The other one, Contending Economic Theories, and the third one, Occupy the Economy. Now, that level of productivity is impressive and slightly panic-inducing, I think. We all feel a little bit bad because that's not all he does, right? Rick, along with Steve Resnick, the late Steve Resnick, spent the last 30 years building a very sophisticated take on Marxian economic theory, building the most unique, probably economics grad student in the US. And I understand, I'm a little biased. I was a student there. This involved going back to Marxian texts to define a surplus-based approach to the economy. He was a wildly popular professor to undergraduate and graduate students. In 2008, he turned his attention a little bit more squarely to popularizing this body of work, as well as to spreading resistance movements in the US, Greece, and elsewhere, groups and movements that questioned the forced austerity programs in the face of record-breaking profits in the US in 2011 and 2012. Rick was in the thick of things, still is, speaking to Occupy protesters in New York, teaching a popular monthly class at the Brecht Forum. Also, he's a board member there. Speaking with Syriza party delegations, visiting with Greek and Spanish social movements, and I know I'm missing a lot else, so I'll stop there. And please welcome our 2 speakers.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Maliha, for a generous introduction. And I'm very glad to be here. Before I tell you what exactly I want to talk about, I want to give a broader framework for the kind of work that I understand GAR to be doing, and that I'm doing, and that others like us are doing. I think we are at an extraordinary historical time. I know you hear that from time to time, but I really do mean that. I don't believe that about a lot of other times, but I do believe it about now. And I didn't even believe it about the situation we're in now as little as 3 or 4 years ago. But I am now persuaded of the following: that capitalism as a system has shifted in a profound way that I think is worth putting as the context for what I have to say. For the first 200 years, roughly, of capitalism's history, maybe 250 years, up till around the 1970s, it was a system that concentrated the good news that it has to offer: technological innovation, rising real wages, decade after decade. It concentrated those benefits, if you like, in North America, Western Europe, and perhaps Japan. And it made most of the rest of the world accept the bad news of capitalism: the extraction of raw materials and minerals at enormous social and human cost, the subordination of economic development to be a poor adjunct to what was the good news in North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Then around the 1970s, and of course it's not just then, but to make the point, around the 1970s, global capitalism changed. It responded to its own history. Capitalist enterprises that for 150 to 200 years had focused on North America, Western Europe, and Japan, had to struggle with their trade unions and their socialist and communist parties, had in the course of events had to raise wages for a variety of reasons, now discovered that with the benefit of modern high-speed jet transportation and the internet and telecommunications, they could do something that hadn't been feasible before. That the ironic opportunity presented to them by the decimation of the third world was transformed into an opportunity. Even the independent struggles of the third world helped create the opportunity. And that opportunity can be described as follows. In China, in India, in Brazil, and all the others, there was a desperation to escape the horrors of what global capitalism had meant for them. They invited the big capitalists of the North to come. And they offered them unspeakably cheap wages, easy government support, absence of costly regulations, all the rest. And with the internet and high-speed travel, it was possible to command and control enterprises in the third world from your base in New York or Chicago about as easily as you could do it before. And so the American capitalist class and the European capitalist class and the Japanese undertook a massive relocation of production from the high-cost areas of its birth to the low-cost desperado locations that it had economically ravaged for a century or two. First it was manufacturing, and then it was white-collar jobs. Until now, almost everything is up for grabs. And here's the point. Capitalism is booming. That's what the stock market explosions mean of the last 35 years. That's what the rapid recovery of the US stock market means now. Profits are booming, but they're profits increasingly located from manufacturing elsewhere, from white-collar jobs elsewhere, and then the final step, from the focus of marketing, advertising of all kinds, government money provided by corporations is now money provided in India and China and Brazil and elsewhere, because that's where the market is growing. The American corporation that used to give money to an American university is now giving that money to a Chinese university, because that's where they want their future employees to be coming from, because that's where their focus is. Americans, Europeans, and Japanese are discovering that the capitalism that gave them a special position is the same capitalism that can take it away and confront them with the prospect that we will only come back to the areas of our origin when you make it as profitable for us to stay as it now is for us to leave. Capitalism no longer delivers the goods in the West. It delivers the bads more and more. Whether it's the absurd debt that the new generation of college students has to take on before they can get a degree, whether it's the wasted cities, the spectacle of a Detroit that decade after decade wallows in the absurdity that are now reaching absolute comic proportions with the receiver of the city, or Camden, New Jersey, or fill in the blank. Therefore, I believe, with or without this crisis, during it now or when it ends, the prospect for the American people, for sure, is a long-term economic decline, confronting them with questions about capitalism they never thought they would have to ask. And that gives us the greatest opportunity for a movement of the left to fundamentally alter things that we have had since the last great collapse of capitalism in the 1930s. And we can already see the signs, whether it's the attention that Gar's work gets or the attention that I get. We, both of us, understand this has very little to do with us. We've been singing pretty much this song quite a while. What has changed is not the song or how we sing it. It's the American audience that suddenly finds this music interesting. And so we have opportunities we didn't have before. It is a historic moment. Capitalism is in question. capitalism, the system, isn't so clearly what's best for America. When I go around the country and end my talks with the remark, "We can do better than capitalism," people have a big fat smile on their faces. I've said the naughty thing, and they're not at risk because I said it. So they can just enjoy it. It's a little bit like a Richard Pryor concert. You wouldn't dare say those things, but you sure love it that he's doing that. So I understand the situation. But it is a historic moment, and the question is now in America, not so much what's wrong with capitalism. They don't need us for that anymore. Their own lives are teaching them that. But what they do need, and what we need to supply, is what do we do now? Where do we go? Or to paraphrase one of the great leaders of our effort, what is to be done? Right? What is to be done? And what answer do we give? Well, I'm going to be blunt in the interest of time. We cannot give the traditional socialist and communist answer. We can't. For two reasons. One, a lot of things went wrong in those early efforts to build an alternative to capitalism. They went wrong. That has to be faced, that has to be understood. We have to figure that out. But here in the United States, we have a second reason, even more important, which is we have half a century of endlessly battering our people with an image of socialism and communism that make them so horrific, so unattractive, so awful, that whatever the reality was, most Americans really don't know. But they do have a clear idea of what the image is that we're supposed to have, and that makes those things impossible at this moment as alternatives. So between the flaws that actually existed in traditional socialism and communism, and they're serious, and the image of those two in the American and European mentality, we have a serious problem. How do we make an advance in that set of circumstances to take advantage of the unique historical situation I tried to summarize? And I think Gar and I, separately, I mean, we know each other, we've worked together, but really separately, have arrived at something that strikes both of us, and I'm not going to speak for Gar, obviously, he will in a minute, but I think we share a sense of a major way forward. I call this a kind of worker co-op movement. And so let me briefly explain what I mean. That we depart from traditional socialism and communism in a very important way. Our focus is not primarily macroeconomic. Mine is not macroeconomic. I am not wrapped up with moving from private property to nationalized to socialized property. I am not primarily excited about moving from markets to planning. Traditional communism and socialism have focused on those two things, the socialization of productive property and the transition from markets to planning. Those are macro level changes. I think they left untouched, or at least put it this way, they left unchanged the micro level. What actually happens in the store, in the office, in the factory. If you don't pay attention to that, you run the following risk. You get rid of the private board of directors selected by the major shareholders, and you substitute government officials. But that may mean that you end up having the workers come to work every day, working in the same way, with the same machine, in the same corner of the factory, producing the same goods, and leaving at the end of the day exactly as they did before, but the board of directors are 16 officials rather than 16 privately elected directors. And if you distribute the resources and the goods in society by means of planners working in the capital, it's not clear how much difference that makes in your life compared to what was done before when these goods were sold in a quid pro quo exchange in a market. It leaves very little change in the daily life of work. So, our focus is that was the missing element. That's one of the major reasons why the revolutions to start socialism and communism, where they happened, were unable to succeed, even to maintain themselves, whatever you think of them. They couldn't survive. And one of the arguments and criticisms of them were they were top-down, they weren't democratic, they weren't controlled from the base. Yeah, but it's the base precisely that you didn't change. It's the organization of the enterprise that you left largely unchanged, at least relative to the changes you made at the macro level. So the idea is to redefine what socialism might mean, whether or not you use the word. And to redefine it by saying, whatever the changes at the macro level, this time we're not going to forget or overlook or minimize or marginalize a transformation at the micro level, at the base. We're going to transform the enterprise. Not in some future time when socialism is more secure. No, no, no. Right now. Right as the central point. And what is meant by this is a radical democratization, if you like. If the word democracy still remains so delicious in your mouth, use it. Democratize the enterprise. What does it mean? That the workers become collectively their own board of directors. That's the role currently occupied by capitalists. They will be removed from that role. They will be replaced by the workers collectively deciding what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the net revenues of the enterprise. Store, factory, office. By net revenues, I'm trying to use a friendly English. The word, of course, that I'm looking for is the surplus. The workers become their own board of directors. The awkward phrase I have come to rely on, workers' self-directed enterprises. That the revolution now means that. Whatever it means at the macro level in terms of property ownership, markets and planning, it is going to have to also include the radical transformation of the enterprise. Because the alternative is to recapitulate the last century, and we don't want to do that. Now, in the time I have left, I have to make a difficult choice. Make more arguments about why it's a good idea. I don't really want to. Talk about the complexity. Well, I've done it so often. So I'm going to try to do it a little bit differently in what time remains to me. I'm going to try to make a case with you. Argue about what some of the concrete benefits, if you like, are from doing this. Because I would do that in a larger audience where I get the chance. I don't know whether the Bill Moyers program, which is re-airing his interview with me this weekend, whether it concentrates on the first of my two interviews with him or the second. If it concentrates on the second, then what I'm doing now is a little bit like what goes on in that interview. By the way, a footnote, Bill Moyers created that opportunity for us and is very sympathetic to what it is I'm saying. If we had enterprises that were worker self-directed, if the workers collectively made the decisions now in the hands of capitalist enterprises, here are some of the consequences I think we can point to and that we could use in building the political support for this. First, I put on my hat as an economist. The single most important factor in shaping the inequality of income and wealth in a capitalist society has to do with the distribution of the surplus. That's always been true. The workers produce a surplus over and above what they get. That is in the hands of capitalists, and how those capitalists distribute that surplus shapes the distribution of income and wealth. If workers made that decision themselves, and that's what workers becoming their own directors means, here are some of the things that would and would not happen. Would you give a wildly disproportionate share of the surplus to a handful of top executives in the manner of how we pay CEOs today? No chance. Number two, would you distribute the same proportion of the surplus you get today in dividends to shareholders? It's not even clear there'd be any shareholders, and even if there were, the chances of your distributing a major share to them, very small. Number three, would the workers collectively distribute an enormous amount of that surplus to the professional staffs of large corporations, the way they are distributed now? Legal staff, architectural staff, major consultants, strategic staff, people with 1, 2, 3, or more MBAs, etc. I don't think so. Four, would they distribute to an army of middle managers, or the more accurate term, supervisors? Or would you imagine that the workers might imagine they could save an awful lot by supervising ourselves, which they would have every interest in doing since they are now the people who run the enterprise? I think it's safe to say that on all of those four counts, or at least on most of them, a worker self-directed enterprise would behave radically differently from the way a capitalist enterprise does. Or to say the same thing as bluntly as I know how, a worker self-directed enterprise would never distribute the surplus of the enterprise it now directs in a manner as unequal as has been the norm in capitalist societies. Or to say the same thing yet another way, after all the, and let's be honest, failed efforts to overcome the inequality of wealth and income characteristic of capitalism, the anti-poverty campaigns, the laws, the progressive tax structure, and none of them have worked. This is the way to do that. The transformation of enterprises is the best structural assault on inequality that is imaginable. Those of you that know the Mondragon system in Spain will know that, depending on which official there you speak to, and I've spoken to a few, the range between the top and the bottom salary is somewhere between 6.5 and 8.5. The norm in the United States in major corporations is on the order of 300 or 400 to 1. So you have a practical example of what is possible over a sustained period. Mondragon's been around over half a century. What is possible in a successfully growing enterprise, as Mondragon has shown itself to be, what is possible with a much narrower inequality than anything a modern capitalism can point to. Number two, I think worker self-directed enterprises would react differently to the problem of ecology and environmental degradation. And here I would make a simple point, but I think crucial here. When workers who are their own directors confront a classic situation, they will react differently. Here's the classic situation. A new technology comes available. It improves the profitability of the enterprise, but at the cost of polluting something, the air, the water, the ground. The corporate heads sitting usually far away, because they are members of Earth First, they weigh the profit gain, which they want, against the ecological degradation, which they abhor, particularly while in church. Okay? And after a serious anguish, they opt to go the direction of more profit, because, you know, competition being what it is. And they are not unmindful of the fact that since they control the surplus, they can give themselves the kinds of salaries and bonuses and perks that will allow them to escape from the very pollution their choice of technology entails. Now switch. Imagine the workers in the enterprise making the same decision. They run the enterprise. We have revolutionized, democratized the enterprise. They also will weigh the benefits of a profit increase. It's important to them too. But they will also weigh the environmental degradation that they will have to drink or breathe or live on, and so will their parents and their children and their neighbors and their communities, and they're going to evaluate that trade-off very differently because they can't escape. And so we're going to get a different pattern of decisions. And that's the point, after all, a different pattern of decisions. So there's an argument for worker self-directed enterprise. Next one. This is easy. You think the workers, if they were their own directors, will sit around and decide, more profitable to produce in China, we'll close the business here, and we'll go to China. It's unlikely. Self-destruction of your job is not a usual desideratum of American workers or of anybody else. You want an assault on runaway shops? Here's how you do it. What do all these things have in common? A simple idea. If you want the economic system to work for the people, you got to put them in charge of the enterprises. Otherwise, you're not serious, are you? I have 1 minute left. Let me go this way. Some questions. Gee, if the workers were in charge, they might pay themselves more. Absolutely right. Probably will. Let me give you an example of how that works. I'm going to compare Walmart, a store you all know and I'm sure go to every other day, okay, and another one called Costco. It's an interesting comparison. Average wage at Walmart's about $12 an hour. Average wage at Costco, $20 an hour. What the hell's going on? Costco from the beginning has paid its workers much better than Walmart. Costco is the 7th largest retailer in the world, is just as profitable as Walmart, maybe more so, and sometimes for sure more so. Is it possible to pay your workers more and to make a success in a capitalist world? Absolutely. The top executive of Costco gets a salary in the hundreds of thousands, which makes him very badly paid by comparison to what those folks usually get. There you go. That's what workers who ran a business themselves, that's what they would do as a matter of course. It wouldn't be necessary for me to pull out Costco as an example because it would become the norm. Okay, last point, promise, last point. Politics. You're all interested in politics. How would workers taking over the enterprise change politics? Well, this goes to the way I began. Today in the United States, the federal government relies for its tax income, for its money income, on taxing individuals for their income and taxing corporations on their profits, their net income. That's where bulk of the money for the federal government comes from. If workers took over the enterprise, we'd have for the first time something new. The government would depend on workers for the individual income tax, but it would have to depend on workers for the enterprise tax too. It would just have to depend on workers in their capacity as individuals and in their capacity as directors of enterprises. And the government dependent on workers. What an interesting idea. That would mean the government was dependent on the majority. That's another interesting idea. That would mean an actual structuralization, a structural basis for democracy about which we talk endlessly in this country, but about which we don't do much. By way of conclusion, there is something remarkable about the United States, endlessly proclaiming itself democratic, justifying the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the name of building or bringing democracy, democracy, democracy. It's endless. And then you realize you're in a society which has always exempted one area from any such requirement: work. You enter the store, you enter the factory, you enter the office, and you give up as a worker all of that. You live with all the decisions that are made in your workplace, but you participate in none of them. They're all made by somebody else, a tiny group making the decisions for a majority. And what is the workplace? I don't know. It's the place you go 5 days a week out of 7, from 9 to 5. It's the single most important place you occupy in your life as an adult. What an interesting commitment to democracy that exempts the place where you spend most of your life. That's a commitment to democracy that is hollow. And that wouldn't be the worst of it. But the social consequences that we're now living through suggest that a transition to a radically different way of organizing enterprises is long overdue and is the best shot we have now for a radical change in the direction of our societies at a time where, if this isn't done, the decline confronting our populations will have catastrophic social consequences. Thank you very much.